I know is from my reading and stories which have flowed down generation after generation. Obviously the conditions on the farms were very bad. There is a lot of literature on the violence on the estates, where employers would beat them up, they will mistreat women, children, etc. It was a life of hell, in short.
So, I mean, the people who came here, the Girmitiyas, they didn't have much right then. They have to just...
No right at all. They were chattels, like slaves. See, the indenture system began after slavery ended. So something had to replace the slave system. And what replaced the slave system was indenture. Now, indentured workers were not brought to Fiji first. They were taken to Caribbean first to replace the slaves, the African slaves. In Fiji, the indenture system started about 50 years after the indentured workers went to the Caribbean, Guyana, the entire Caribbean area. So it was virtual slavery in that sense.
So when was the slavery, between which year and which year?
Well, slavery continued from about 1500s, all the way up to early part of 1800s.
So the first people who came to Fiji were slaves, they were not Girmitiyas?
No. See, slavery, you know about slaves.
Right.
The Africans who were brought to America,
Right.
they came as slaves.
Right.
Slavery, Now when the slave system ended, then there was a need to replace that system with something else. You had to have cheap workers, and whites won't do the kind of work that you could make non-white people do. So the indenture system emerged as a result of that.
Okay. So you think there were other people here as slaves before Indians?
Yes, there were the Melanesians, people from Solomon Islands and New Hebrides, which is now called New Caledonia. There are still settlements of Solomon Islands in Fiji. They came as slaves. The people were caught literally on those islands and shipped to Fiji. Now that was called the era of black bedding. Now that became illegal because slavery was illegal. So the next was to get workers from India as indentured workers.
Why India? I mean, why they brought Indians?
Indians were docile. Britain ruled India. India was a very large colony of Britain, so it was easy. They were hard workers, we were told.
Repeat that line again. Why Indians?
Britain was the colonial power in India, so it was a very large colony. Indenture system was essentially a British system, where slavery was essentially Spanish, Portuguese, American system. Also Indians were supposed to be docile and hard workers.
So do you remember how many people died, like when Girmitiyas came?
No, Brijlal would be the best.
Okay, okay, like what kind of medical facilities?
None.
None?
None. Medical facilities, from what we gather, there were none, because the only medical facilities were the colonial government controlled hospitals and dispensaries, and these were far away from where the indentured workers were made to work. So there was no medical facility, so to say. People would give birth on the plantations, and there will be deaths occurring there. People would get sick and die.
And nobody cared?
Nobody would care.
What about some of the people who, after their contract they were supposed to return?
No, everyone had a right to return. Everyone had a right under the agreement to go back after 5 years at their own fare, at their own cost. Or they could stay for another 5 years and again return, but at the cost of the employer. Now many people did return. Some of them went back from Fiji and went to another country, for example Africa or Guyana. Some went to Guyana and came to Fiji. So there was a fair bit of movement of people, but most did not return.
So why you think they brought Indians to Fiji anyway? I mean, there was a need for
workers. You needed workers. You needed workers here. The indigenous population faced there was a massive decline in population because of a measles epidemic. Also, because they had their own land, and land is a very important what's called means of production. If they could produce their own livelihood, there was no point in working for someone else for a wage which you use then to buy a livelihood. So the indigenous people were not willing to work under those conditions. You needed substitutes, and these happened to be people who could be brought under the indenture system.
So you think everybody was paid fairly, or you think they cheated in?
Well, certainly not. There is a lot of literature on the wage rates. If you take sugar plantation, for example, the wage rate on the sugar plantations was about a third of what the wage rate was in Australian sugar plantations, for example. So obviously it's not a very fair system, is it?
Okay. How many hours do you think they were working?
Oh, anywhere from 9 to 14 hours, depending on the employer that you have. There was also a task system where tasks would be given. Sometimes you could finish the task earlier and move on.
So, I mean, you think the kids were working and women were working
Everyone,
in the field too?
everyone.
What were their functions? I mean,
every kind of work that your employer would tell you to do, from plowing the land to cutting trees to cultivation to housework, cleaning, you name it.
and if you refuse?
Well, you had no option of refusing because your meals depended on what you got as the wage from the employer. If you refused, what do? Some people did refuse and they ran off into the Fijian villages. In some places the Fijian villages sheltered them very willingly, but then the British government put in a law which made it illegal for the indigenous people to shelter those workers who ran away from the farms.
So how was the communication between Indians and Fijians, because they were speaking Hindi and they were speaking Fijian, nobody knew English, so how?
Oh yeah, human beings adjust very rapidly, you know, from one word to the other, and then you learn.
What do you mean?
You don't need to actually utter a single word to understand, communicate pain. To communicate pain, you don't even need to utter a word. People understand, human beings understand when people are hurt.
So I thought that they were cannibals. They were living in village. I mean, back then.
No, that's a very westernized way of looking at the indigenous people of Fiji. Certainly cannibalism was prevalent, but that was centuries before the indentured workers came here. Cannibalism was not a general phenomena rampant in the islands, otherwise they would be eating each other, you see.
Okay. So what about education? You think the people who came here had any education?
No, they were not educated in the way that we see education. Obviously they were literate in their own language, in their own shastras, you know, the religious books, but there was no school here. The first schools were established by the descendants of the Girmitiyas, who had become what is called free workers in the early part of 1900s. These were community schools, you know, small bures or shacks in which you teach 5-10 children. That was the foundation of education for the Indians in Fiji.
So who was teaching them? Because I thought all these people who came were uneducated, low class.
Now, as I said, not education in the Western sense, but they knew their own literature, they knew their own language, they knew their own alphabets. Not all of them, but quite a few of them knew that. So they started teaching their children and their neighbors' children basic elements of education. For example, alphabet, Hindi, how to write your name in Hindi, how to write sentences in Hindi, how to read Hindi. And as people began to communicate more and more with India, teachers began to be brought in from India to come and teach in Fiji. There were many teachers who came during indenture and after indenture.
So you think And after the independence, this is before independence.
This is during Grimit and after Grimit.
Right. So before the independence, up to independence.
No, not independence. Independence was in 1970. You know,
Right.
we are going back from 1879 up to 1916. Now, schools were established in around 1900s. The first school to be established was in Wairuku in Rekireki. Then there was another school established in Lotoka, Saveni, where the new university is. That was way back in 1904. Now, schools were essentially huts where children would be brought in to be taught basic alphabets, basic reading and writing culture.
So let's talk about the land lease. Before then, were Indians supposed to buy the land so they could?
No, there was no. The sale of indigenous land ended with Seatha Gordon. That was before the indentured workers arrived here. There was no sale after that, except for a very brief period in 1902 to 1904 or thereabouts, when Governor Im Then opened up sales of land. But the amount sold was very much negligible. I think that the British government actually put a stop to it.
So Indians didn't own land,
No.
but they used to lease it.
They could lease it, yes.
From who?
From the Colonial Sugar Refining Company, CSR, from other landlords, including indigenous landowners.
You think the lease was, payable? Good? You think they were honest?
Well, that life was better than life of a Girmitiya, that is for certain. Life on a leased land was much better.
Okay. So let's go a little bit forward here. You think Fiji needed independence in 1970, or why was the independent anyway?
Yes. You see, a human being doesn't like to live in bondage. Colonial rule was bondage for people of Fiji. That included indigenous and the descendants of the Girmitiyas, all of them combined. So there was a need for independence. There is no question about it.
So life was much better, you think, before the independence or after the independence of both?
You can't generalize that life was better or not better for everyone. There were a large number of people who enjoyed life during colonial periods. There are a large number of people who enjoy life now. There are a large number of people now who are in poverty situations. So it depends on the individual circumstances, but generally we can say that the standard of living in Fiji has improved significantly after independence. In 1973, 72, 73, when the talks were going on for the government to take over the sugar milling operation, the government bought the sugar mills from the CSR. The sugar cane prices rose rapidly, and that increase in sugar cane prices helped the entire nation, let alone the farmers who were involved in that. So in that way, the standard of living shot up significantly.
So it was good for India?
Oh, for everyone.
So they were paid much less before the government bought?
Yes, they were
paid. Why was that?
Why was that? It was an Australian company. It was a British government. The farmers' organizations were very weak here. There was only one reputable cane farmers organization called the Fiji Kisan Sangh, and they were all basic problems of lack of negotiating skills, lack of knowledge of how the industry operated in other countries. All these factors combined to have a low price of sugarcane.
So let's talk, were Fijians getting educated at the same time before the independence, or they were like basically living in village?
No, they were getting independence.
How are they getting educated?
Through the British government. The British government established special schools for indigenous people. Two of the notable ones were the QVS, the Queen Victoria School, which was a specialized school for the chiefs' children, and then the RKS, the Ratukan Davulevu School, which was a specialized school for the second layer of indigenous Fijians' children. So there were specialized schools for the indigenous people, there were special schools for the European and the part European people of mixed blood, but there was none for the Indians. The Indians had to establish their own schools through their own community effort.
They are. Good, you're good. I'm not done yet.
I have to be rushing.
Okay, so let's talk a couple more things. What do you see the future of Fiji?
Future of Fiji is as good as what people make out of it. People of every community here. Our future is in our hands. If we squander it and mess it up, future will be pretty bad. But if we make the right decisions, right choices, I think the future is very bright.
Perfect.